time for us to check back in with the People and Their Quilts. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Maxine and Edmund Shanlever, with quilts made by their grandmothers. Maxie Shanlever, 86 years young, and her brother Edmund Shanlever are shown here at their Dutch Valley, Tennessee home with 2 quilts made by their grandmothers. The one on the left was made by their grandmother Coward. The Cowards lived between Clinton and Oak Ridge on the Clinch River and were an early and prominent family of Anderson County. The Coward farm lay on both sides of the river, necessitating the use of a ferry to get to and from the portion of land on the opposite side. Maxie stated that her grandfather Coward died when he was only 42 and that her grandmother had 9 children to raise. She wasn't sure how old the quilt was, but was positive that it was well over 100 years old. The quilt folded at the right was made by Talitha Moore Shanlever, the paternal grandmother of Maxie and Edmund. She also lived on the Clinch River. The Moores, too, were an old and prominent family of the area, becoming large coal mining operators in later years. "I don't know how old this quilt is," Maxie said, "but it's been here a lot longer than I have." "How long has that been?" I asked, in an endeavor to learn her age. She was too smart for such elementary subtlety. "A long time," she replied. She did eventually divulge that she had been living in the valley for 86 years. For 42 of those years, she was a school teacher known by thousands of students as Miss Maxie. Both quilts are believed to date from the 1850 to 1870 period. They were used very little, Maxie recalls. "I remember my mother hanging them out to air in the spring of the year. I thought that they were pretty, but after Mother died, they were pretty much left packed away for all these years. But here of late, I appreciate them more. I get them out and look at them more than I used to." Pennsylvania Swatch Quilt. Agnes Gounder and her husband operated a hotel in Orwinsburg, Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, which was frequented by traveling salesmen, or drummers as they were commonly called. Many of these drummers sold suits and other clothing, and they carried with them small strips of the cloth as samples of the material from which the garments were made. These were called swatches, and Agnes Gounder, being the frugal German she was, collected these swatches from her guests and made them into a quilt. On this quilt, the infinite variety of flowers, horseshoes, etc., are embroidered with crewel-type stitching. The center square is 6 times as large as the other squares and contains the date 1895, a number of flowers, and the very ornate and highly embellished letters R.K.M., which were the initials of Agnes's mother, Rebecca K. Meyer, for whom the quilt was made. When her mother died, the quilt came back to Agnes, and upon her death, the quilt went to her daughter, May Agnes Gounder Lovett. She later gave it to her son, James E. Lovett, who lived in Georgia and South Carolina before joining the Tennessee Valley Authority in Knoxville as an engineer. James later worked as an engineer with other firms and founded 2 businesses of his own. He is currently director of the Air Pollution Control Department, Knox County, Tennessee. James remembers hearing stories that indicated his grandmother Agnes was pretty much the manager of the family. He recalls having heard on more than one occasion that Grandpa Gounder went off to Philadelphia, became involved with racehorses and such, and traded the hotel for what he thought was a fine racehorse, which proved to be a worthless nag. Grandma Gounder was not at all happy about that. Quilts with stories to tell. It's hard to imagine any type of household item which collectively or individually convey such interesting, warm, and personal stories as do quilts. Virtually every quilt has a background composed of the human involvement, the love, and the labor which went into its creation. Unfortunately, the intimate details of the life of a quilt are seldom known, but occasionally fragmented stories regarding the quilts have been passed down from earlier generations. Some of these stories are most interesting and revealing. Attempts have been made to authenticate the accuracy of the histories and folk stories connected with certain quilts. While some of the stories have been passed along with the quilt itself from one generation to another, the stories probably have been changed somewhat over the years. One may assume, however, that the stories had a basis in fact, and knowing that the stories were considered worthy of telling so many times is itself significant. The flag quilt, circled star. Although the woman who made this quilt lived in Tullahoma in the southern part of Middle Tennessee, near the Alabama line, both her husband and son fought with the Union side during the Civil War. She wanted to make a patriotic quilt based on the United States flag, but she did not want to incur the wrath of Southern sympathizers by having it resemble a Yankee flag in color and design. So she made a red, white, and blue quilt which contained the stars and stripes, but changed the configuration so that one could not readily discern it was based on the U.S. flag. This is a concept similar to that employed by Amanda McDowell in making her concealed flag. This is believed to be an original design and to have been made about 1860. The backing is made of homespun fabric, and it has borders only on two sides. It was made for a bed that was to be positioned against a wall. Allison Arnold bought the quilt from the great-granddaughter of its maker and presented it to her husband as an anniversary present. It has since appeared in the magazine Ladies' Circle Patchwork Quilts and has hung in the McClung Museum in Knoxville during the 1982 World's Fair, photographed at the Museum of Appalachia. The flag that was hidden in a quilt. Curtis McDowell was principal of a small subscriptive school called Cumberland Institute in the Middle Tennessee mountains near the town of Sparta during the Civil War. Although he had sons in both the Northern and Southern armies, McDowell retained allegiance to the United States government, and he faced a formidable decision. He could continue to fly the United States flag or hide it for later use, and almost surely have his school and perhaps his family destroyed by the Confederates, or he could destroy the flag, assume a neutral position, and be relatively safe from the ravages of both sides. He chose instead another alternative, more palatable, imaginative, and certainly more romantic. He and his daughter Amanda chose to retain the flag, but to conceal it in such a manner as to ensure that it could never be found. Amanda cut the flag into thousands of half-inch square pieces and made it into a triple Irish chain quilt that bore no resemblance to the design of the flag. The flag in this transformed state could be openly displayed even in front of Confederate soldiers. None ever suspected this quilt was in fact Old Glory. The quilt remains in the possession of the McDowell family, belonging to Jack McDowell, a chemist who lives near Oak Ridge in Anderson County, Tennessee. Equally as interesting is the fact that the details of this event were recorded by Amanda McDowell herself in the form of a diary, which she kept throughout this period. The diary is also in the possession of Jack and Betty McDowell. The diary is in good condition except for numerous lines which have been carefully cut from the pages. The story is that Amanda had referred to Larkin Craig, her lover, in these lines. After the two parted company and Amanda married another man, she went back and removed all of the amorous allusions to him. This diary was used as a basis for a historical novel called Fiddles in the Cumberlands, written and published by Leila McDowell Blankenship, Amanda's niece. The following account is from the book and is accompanied by a footnote from the author. At the school there had so far been quiet, but it was well known that a division of sentiment smoldered among the students. Perhaps Curtis McDowell had been given more consideration because it was apparent that his two sons were divided on their opinion of the national crisis, Fayette siding warmly with the Confederates and Jack taking a decided stand against secession. But in spite of this escape from the marauding element that had kept the valley in an uproar, Amanda and Mary always dreaded a visit from sympathizers of either side. One evening they heard hoofs clatter to a stop at the gate in front of their home and gave each other a look of dread before they went together to the door. Their father was meeting with some students at the schoolhouse, and they expected to direct the riders there. They were surprised to see the schoolhouse showing no signs of life and the men dismounting to come in. "Is McDowell here?" one of the Confederate soldiers inquired, and the girls saw that he had the flag from the schoolhouse, the flag Amanda had so carefully made when the debating society had requested it. "He is not here," Amanda said calmly, but her hand went out toward the latch of the door. "Well, we can leave this and our message here." As the leader said that, he tore the flag across and dropped it to the ground, and the 2 or 3 of them stamped it with their boots. "Tell McDowell that this is the way we feel about his flag, and he had better keep it down." They had learned early in the disturbance to have as little to say as possible, so they made no answer, but stepping backward enough to close the door and slide the heavy latch into place. They heard the men remount and all turned toward the valley with a great clatter and shouting. A few minutes later, their father and some students came up. The girls felt a great relief. They had feared their father would not take the insult quietly, but he too had known what was best, and he had kept back in one of the cabins where he had gone instead of the schoolhouse, as they had believed. Sorrowfully, Amanda gathered up the torn flag and took it in the house. She stored it in the chest after cleaning the mud footprints away, and said that later she and Mary would make it into a quilt. This is an actual happening that has been told in the presence of our family many times. I now have the quilt made from the blue and white of the flag, pieced by Amanda, and Mrs. Monroe Bartlett had the red and white quilt pieced by Mary. Leila McDowell Blankenship. The tablecloth quilt. My mother had a tablecloth with a pretty rose on it, and she got the idea of making a quilt using that pattern. Chris Keyes pointed out. She just drew this pattern, the satin stitch rose she called it, then she embroidered it, and then quilted it. The one-hand quilt, Cranny, West Virginia. Cranny, West Virginia was located in Wyoming County on the Clear Fork of the Gyndock River. It was a most remote area, and like many late and inaccessible frontier areas, it is now void of people and has returned to its original state of nature. One of the few reminders of the several generations of people who lived there is this quilt. It is most remarkable in that it was quilted by a woman who was almost totally crippled in her right hand. It was displayed in the 1983 Museum of Appalachia Quilt Show by Knoxville businessman Ed Lambert, its present owner and grandson of the lady who made it. Ed himself tells of its history. Dan Gunno and his bride, Ada Marshall, built their home in Cranny just above the Marshall Place on Clear Fork of the Gyndock River. As the years faded away, the Gunnos raised 4 boys and 3 girls, and Uncle Dan, as the community affectionately called him, became the postmaster and the most affluent man in the area. One by one, the children left their hearthside until only memories warmed there. Today the home is gone and nothing remains except on a nearby knoll grown thick with greenbrier and other bramble. There are markers on the graves of some 30 or 40 of the pioneers of the area. Dan and Eda's graves are the most prominent in the cemetery, being situated under an old cedar tree whose thick foliage has prevented any undergrowth on their resting places. Before Ada passed on in 1929, she made a quilt for each of her surviving children. This quilt was made for her daughter, Lake. Her right hand was paralyzed in a closed position, and she inserted the needle by holding it with her knuckles of her ring and middle finger. Her left hand did most of the work. The quilt belonged to Lake, the mother of its present owner, who died at age 86 in 1965. She used the quilt in her home for more than 40 years. Lake's quilt is 70 inches by 72 inches. The design is a variation of a common pattern of the day, pine tree. There are 6 or 7 stitches to the inch, and the rows of stitches are ½ inch apart. The quilting alone has an estimated 60,000 stitches, not including the patchwork. Cranny is gone, the old house and furnishings are gone, Dan and Eda are gone, the children are gone, but the love that Eda put in these quilts and the warmth they emit are still with us. Dan and Etta Gunno are shown in a photograph reproduced from one taken in 1928. Etta made this fine quilt for her daughter, using only her left hand as her right one was paralyzed in a closed position, courtesy of their grandson, Ed Lambert. The Salt Bag Quilt, Coiled Rattlesnake. In going through the packed-away quilts in the John Carrico home, daughter Star Carrico commented on each one as she removed it from the chest or from the dresser drawer. Now this one was made by Daddy's Aunt LaRue Lawson. She made it out of salt bags. Back then they sold salt in cloth bags, and she saved them up and finally got enough to make herself a quilt. She called this one Quilted Rattlesnake. The pattern is perhaps more generally known as Baby Bunting. This same pattern was found on a quilt at the Ellis Stewart place, and they also called it Quilted Rattlesnake. The Stewart's home on Newman's Ridge in Hancock County is about 85 miles from the Carrico home in Scott County, Virginia. Laura Carrico and her Tragedy Quilt. Laura Carrico holds the quilt which her mother pieced for Laura's son, Hershey. Laura sadly recalls the story. Mother, her name was Yvonne, but everybody called her Vaughn Smith Blannery. She pieced this quilt for her only son, who was killed in a motorcycle wreck in 1947, and after he was killed, she just put it up and never finished it. It's laid in there, packed away in the back room ever since. Laura Carrico lives in Scott County, Virginia, about halfway between Gate City and historic Fort Blackmore on the Clinch River. She and her late husband, John Carrico, grew up there with the renowned Mother Maybelle Carter and her family. John was a sawmiller, farmer, carpenter, musician, corn miller, maker of Kentucky rifles, etc. He was a collector of Indian relics and frontier-related items and had an impressive collection of these artifacts. I learned that Laura had made quilts for most of her life, but had been unable to do so recently because of her health. She lives on the old home place with Star, her only living child. Martha Stooksbury Memorial Quilt. In the course of the conversation with Bonnie Carden, she told me of an old quilt which she thought might be of interest to me, and indeed it was. Mother had a sister named Martha who died at the age of 19 of typhoid fever, about 1885. Well, she had a nice dress made out of what they called madras cotton, but it was customary to bury people in new clothing, so they made, or had made, a new dress to bury her in. But her mother, that was my grandmother, took that cotton dress and made it into this quilt. My grandmother, Sarah Oaks Stooksbury, made the quilt from her daughter, Martha's dress, after she died. She had 8 children, and Martha was one of the 8. When my grandmother died in 1914, she gave the quilt to my mother, who kept it all these years, and then she left it for me. You can see that it's been used a lot somewhere along the line, but I don't think Mother ever used it after she got it. The Louisa Sharp Stooksbury Memorial Quilt. I'd never heard of the custom of making a quilt from the dress of a recently deceased family member until Bonnie Carden told me of the quilt made from her aunt's dress. On the same day, January 14, 1983, that Bonnie informed me of this incident, my Aunt Willie told me a similar story relating to her grandmother, Louisa Sharp Stooksbury. Her husband, Louis Stooksbury, who lived near Lewiston in Union County, Tennessee, was a cousin to Martha Stooksbury, for whom the other memorial quilt was made. Willie told the story as she had heard it so often from her father, Lawrence Stooksbury. Grandmother Stooksbury died during the birth of her 14th child. That was in 1897, and she was just 43 years old. She had this dress that was made out of pure silk, or so they said, and Grandmother's daughter, Aunt Pearl, took that dress and made it into this quilt. I guess it was one of those full-length dresses, and it made the entire top of the quilt. Aunt Pearl was just 15 when her mother died, and I think she made the quilt soon afterwards, in 1897 or 98, I guess. She was sickly and never married, and didn't live too long herself. Just before she died, she gave this quilt to Dad because she said she knowed he would take care of it. Well, he did take good care of it. He never let it be used, and he wouldn't let us kids bother it. And after he died, I brought it up here, but I'd like for you to take it and put it in your museum so it can be seen. Louisa Sharp Stewksbury. I don't know whether or not this practice was widespread or if it was only a local custom, but it seems a more practical and respectful thing to do. The quilt serves as a remembrance of the departed one, and at that same time it serves a useful purpose. It is interesting to note that in both instances the material was not cut into small pieces, but rather was used in large sections as possible. When Louisa Stewksbury died at the age of 42 with the birth of her 14th child, one of her daughters took her silk dress and made it into this quilt, upon which her great-great-granddaughter, Missy Irwin, is shown. The bed also belonged to Louis and Louisa Stewksbury. And we'll stop right there for today. Another interesting peek into the old quilts of that area. I'm so glad that John Rice documented all this, such wonderful stories. The very first one I really liked. I liked all of them, but Maxie Shantlever, she said her and her brother were showing those quilts and talking about them. But I loved it that she said she cared more about them now as she got older. She was in her 80s. Was it 85, 86? 86, I think. It's that really stuck out to me because the older I get, I care about stuff like that more, and I ponder the people that either I never knew in my family or ones that have been gone a long time, like Papa Wade, and even my Mama Marie has been gone since I was in 5th grade. I really think about them, and I don't know, somehow they become even more precious to me as I get older, so I really liked that part. I think that a lot of people do that in your older years, especially. You begin to look backwards. It reminds me of, not that she was doing that or not that I'm doing that at all either, but my Aunt Ina, my great Aunt Ina, when she was dying and she was sick, I remember me and my Uncle Henry went to see her in the hospital, and some of her kids, grown kids, they're both passed away now too, but they were there with her, and she was, she was sick, but also it was affecting her mind, and she was talking though, but what she was worrying about was that she wanted to know when her mother and Marie, my grandmother, was her sister, when they were coming. Why hadn't they come to get her, And it was like her mind had been took way back to then, instead of like the more recent time when she was there with her grown children and her grandkids and all that. So it's those, I guess there's a saying about it, what those first days at the last, I'm not going to be able to say it, but you probably know the saying I'm talking about. What was first will be last, or what will last will be first. I don't know how they say it, but somehow your mind goes back to those impressionable days of childhood, even though, or early adulthood, all those things, even though your life has passed that. I don't know. Pretty deep there thinking about what she said, but that's what it brought to mind for me. And then the two flag quilts, how, such a terrible time in our country, of course, and can't imagine the heartache of families in those days, but the first one that was just the circled star, which was really beautiful. Again, interesting that, and John Rice had mentioned this back at the beginning of the book, how some of those quilts, those old ones, you notice they're only bordered on like two sides because they knew that nobody would see that other two sides because of how the bed was positioned on the wall. Now, one thing that makes me think about is did they never move their bed? Like a lot of us today want to change our room around. Corey and Katie were always big on changing their room around. They'd want to change it this way and that way. And it's funny, me and Matt can't really change our bed because we didn't think about when we laid out our house and built it, we didn't think about it. So there's like a window that would go behind the bed. It can't be on that wall. Can't be on one wall because a door to a bathroom's there. Can't be on the other wall because there's a closet there. So there's really only one place mine and his bed can be. So, but I would need one that shows, because you'd be able to see all the way around my bed, so I'd need one that was bordered on all sides. But interesting to think about that part, how they place their bed, but also just the frugal nature. They had to work so hard to get those quilt scraps and get that cloth that they didn't see any reason to waste any on a part that you wasn't going to see, So I really liked that part. And then the next flag story, how wonderful that they have that part of the diary that kind of tells that story. Such scary times and all that, but gosh, you got to love that they were determined to hold on to that flag, so they cut it up and hid it in plain sight, I guess you would say, and still got to use it. So that was just a beautiful, beautiful story. And then kind of determined in that sense too, but then the real determination was the next one, the one-hand quilt. Determined, my goodness, not only was she so determined to work with only one hand, but then also those perfect little stitches. John Rice made note of that, those perfect little stitches that she did somehow by using her knuckle and her other hand. I can't imagine the determination. I would have probably said, I quit, I can't do it, I can't figure out how to do that. So I really, really admire that. And then the last kind of ones we talked about that he talked to, the Carden and the Stooksbury there, and they were talking about using those. They'd use the women's dresses, the young lady that was only 19 that died, and then the lady that was only 42 or 43, what it was, the mother that died, and they used their dresses like to as part of those quilts. That's so precious and such meaningful, I think it's meaningful, even the ones we've read where they saved all the pockets off the overalls and things, and they used those because they didn't wear out as much. That's precious too. But so meaningful to use, the dress that those women wore that they died and then could no longer wear. It reminds me, I hear a lot of people today talk about, I had a friend that her father-in-law died, and then after he'd passed away, his wife and children, they got some of his clothes and they took them to someone who then turned the clothes into like a special little teddy bear for the grandkids, but it was made out of his clothing. So I thought that was really sweet. And then I know some of you do those kind of things too, with taking clothing from a deceased person and then making it into a quilt or something like that. I know some of you do the same thing, and it just gives something, it's a way of holding on to those clothes without just letting them hang or folding them up, putting them somewhere. You can actually turn them into something that you can use, but then is very, very meaningful to you because, of course, the clothes come from your loved one. So that's really touching, and really touching that people still do that today. That's still, we all of us, that's human nature. When you really love someone and they pass away, you want to hold on to all those memories of them and try to keep a piece of them. Of course, the memories, real memories, live in your heart and in your brain, and your, I like to think of it as the filing cabinets of your brain. They're still there. But wonderful to hold on to pieces of them like that too, that just so every time your eye kind of lands on it, makes you remember. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what you thought about it. Of course, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. We got to see what he talks about next.